Thank you, Professor Sundarajan, for your very kind words. I did not know that your pet figure of speech was hyperbole. President of Jain University Trust, Dr. Chandraj Raichan, distinguished chairman of ICHR, sorry, my throat is of ICHR, Professor Sudarshan Rao, Vice Chancellor of Jain University, Professor Sundarajan, Professor R.N. Iyengar, ladies and gentlemen. At the very outset, I wish to congratulate my distinguished friend, Professor R.N. Iyengar, on having organized this seminar on a fascinating subject, Indian intellectual traditions in ancient India. I went through the program, which seems to be impressive, and I am glad a number of distinguished scholars, they are before me, Professor N.D. Srinivas, Ram Subramaniam, Danino and others, they are all participating in it. I am also happy that I have the opportunity of being with you this morning at this function to share some thoughts on this vast subject with you. Since I have some problem, occasional bouts of forgetfulness, I have just dressed up some material so that the unpleasantness could be avoided. Apart from the impressive archaeological artifacts of the Harappan culture, we speak about their intellectual tradition. That tradition or intellectual tradition in ancient India was indeed a complex one, but clear and precise in its goal. Complex in the sense of an intertwined broad spectrum of literary expositions and practices which have been bequeathed to us from the Vedic times and spanning a period of at least 3,500 years. For the Vedas, already reference was made, the four Vedas, Brahmanas, Aranyakas, Upanishads and Vedangas, the six systems of Arshad Darshanas, Sankhya, Vaisheshika, Nyaya, Yoga, Purva and Uttara Mimamsas, the epics, Puranas and Dharmashastras, the incisive literature on Jainism and Buddhism, the host of literary commentaries on all of these, as well as new formulations, but within the Upanishadic frame, concerning the interrelationship between Jivatma and Paramatma, as expounded by Shankara, Ramanuja and Madhva. All of these and the diverse forms of arts and different styles of music were in the nature of watermarks of the multi-level intellectual tradition in ancient India till the 12th century CE. Though some of them appear to be in apparent conflict or entanglement among themselves, now and then, the goal of all of them was precise and noble. It was in the main a philosophy of man, of his refinement through subjugation of his six vicious internal force, Kama, Krodha, Lobha, Moha, Mada and Matsarya, and finally his liberation from worldly bondage. Indian intellectual tradition was thus deeply involved in shaping man into a human being. He is leading an exalted life of noble values based on dharma, which was and has been the bedrock of the Indian way of living. In this context, some reflections on our scientific heritage may be desirable, since this heritage was an integrated component of the intellectual tradition in ancient India. In the human adventure of scientific ideas, the earliest and the fascinating thought matrix was of the triple standard man, spirit, and cosmos vision, a holistic vision of the outer material man and his inner spirituality, and the two together, the inner spirit, the outer man, the inner spirit, the two together being in concord with the cosmos. This is the earliest of the scientific ideas. In fact, anthropologists perceive such a vision even in the cave drawings of early man as early as 10,000 BC. This vision, holistic as it was a fountain source of all knowledge and practices, be it religious, philosophic, metaphysical, or the different modes, be it astronomy, mathematics, medicine, or biological realm. One notices glimpses of such a coherent vision in different cultures. For example, in hieratic cultural phase of Egyptians, among the Akkadians, Sumerians, Babylonians, and Chaldeans in the Mesopotamian cultural milieu, among the Chinese as well as the far-off South American Mayas, though in a subdued manner. But it was the Indian culture area that had affirmed itself as the most committed one for fostering the man, spirit, and cosmos harmonious relationship. This was the inspiration for all its intellectual tradition of metaphysical concepts, knowledge of celestial bodies, healing art, as well as physical and the biological world in general. The pristine idea of the Vedic seers was the recognition that the universe was not capricious, but ordered ensemble governed by the cosmic or natural law or order. It was called Ruta, which had also its moral dimensions. In no other ancient culture was there such a vision of the natural order and articulated in such a detailed manner as in the Rig Veda about 4,000 years ago. The other civilizations too had their views on natural order. For example, the Egyptian Math, the Zoroastrian Asha, the much later Chinese Qi and Li, as well as the Tao, you must have heard of it, which came up around this 5th century BCE, and the Greek approach to natural law called Moira, as conceived by the Stoics in the 3rd century BC, were rather inchoate and conceptually weak when compared with the Rigvedic one. There are nearly 400 mantras spread over in different suktas of the Rig Veda and also in Krishna Yajurveda, which extol the eternal natural law and its moral garment. Even the Vedic gods, representing different forms and forces of nature, were enjoined to follow this law and protect it too. The sun was eulogized as being a dweller in this law, which alone operated and regulated all movements and activities in the celestial and terrestrial realms. The Vedic idea of sin, papa, that was in the context of the transgression of this all-powerful law. More importantly, Ruta was inseparably associated with yajna, or the performance of sacrifice. Yajna, as you know, was the kernel of the Vedic way of life. In fact, yajna was regarded as the abode of Ruta, Rutasya Dhama, and was also conceived as being the navel, nabhi of the universe. Thus, the man spirit cosmos was envisioned and the universal law recognized. It may be noted that, as A.N. Whitehead, one of the most eminent mathematicians and philosophers of science, he said, there can be no living science unless there is an instinctive conviction in the existence of an order, in particular of the order of nature. Such a conviction was clearly discernible in all thoughts and practices in ancient India from Vedic time onwards. The word dharma occurs in the Rig Veda nearly 60 times, connoting such actions as would sustain the world in the wider context of the eternal order or moral law, harmony and truth, or even satya as the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad expounds. A few other Upanishads extol dharma as the firm foundation on which the whole universe stands. Though in the post-Vedic period, the importance of dharma became pronounced through the Dharmashastra texts and the epics, the Vedic yajna performances continue to hold the ground even today, since the performer was hailed as the one who adopted and adhered to dharma in exemplary manner. To this integrated vision of Rita, Yajna and Dharma, the tradition of Indian astronomy and mathematics was its origin. The Vedanga Jyotisha, one of the auxiliaries of the Vedas, states, I quote, the Vedas have indeed been revealed for the sake of the performance of yajnas, but these yajnas have been set out to be performed according to specific sequences of time. Therefore, only he who knows astronomy, the science of time, understands the importance of the yajnas. The text further adds that it is astronomy that has been regarded as the head of the 6 auxiliaries of the Vedangas, and the crown of the Vedas, and likens it to the combs of peacock and the crest jewel of a serpent. Reckoning exact time for the commencement and ending of yajna based on lunar and solar movements, nakshatras, solstices, months and years became a felt necessity. Thus, to begin with, astronomy arose as an important auxiliary of the Vedas. The yajnas of diverse intent needed to be performed in altars of specific design and measurements, involving bricks of different geometrical shapes, triangular, rectangular, square, and other types. The early Indian texts on geometry and algebra are the Sulba Sutras of another Vedanga called the Kalpa, which deal with these aspects in an elegant manner. The idea of permutations and combination also can be found in another Vedanga known as Chandaha, which was developed in Pingala's Chanda Sutra. Thus, Indian astronomy and mathematics in their origins were not in the nature of just academic pursuits, but in the context of yajna, ruta, and dharma. I emphasize the word dharma. Alongside the exposition of the non-duality or the identity of the individual soul with the universal self or Brahman, as expounded by Upanishads, pointed to the potentiality of the human to attain the divine level. In this process of exalted thinking and in the ambience of Rita, Satya and Dharma, the mundane goal of man became fourfold: Dharma, Artha, Kama and Moksha, Dharma taking the very first place among them. To realize the fourfold goals, body and mind needed to be not only in complete concord between them, but also beyond, with nature itself. The Sankhya system, through its exposition of the equilibrium or balance or harmony of the 3 gunas, Sattva, Rajas and Tamas, and the evolution that ensues, by interaction by Purusha, provided the basic ideas for the emergence of Ayurveda. How philosophical foundations were there for Ayurveda. This was reinforced by the Vaisheshika system of thinking with its perspicacious presentation on matter and its properties. While Sankhya emphasized man and nature, Vaisheshika emphasized man and matter. And the Nyaya system lent its epistemological support. Inspired by a confluence of such intellectual expositions, especially the Sankhya, the maintenance of equilibrium or harmony in all bodily processes as well as mind, and both in perfect equilibrium with the environment of our nature, became a foundational concept of Ayurveda. It is known as Loka Purusha Samya, a very fundamental concept of Ayurveda. It's the consonance of the microcosm with the macrocosm. The other basic ideas like the three humors, you must have heard of it, Vata, Pitta and Kapha, as well as the role of the Panchabhutas, or the five elements, I shall explain to them a little later, of the Sankhya and the Vaisheshika systems, were rationally formulated and practiced even a few centuries before the Christian era. However, this text-stabilized classical Ayurvedic compendia, the Charaka Samhita, Susha Samhita, came up in the early centuries of the Christian era. It's important to note, the Charaka Samhita clearly states that to realize the fourfold goals of life to which I refer, Dharma, Artha, Kama and Moksha, man needs to be healthy and strong, sincerely adhering to Dharma in all of its requirements. One of the doctrines that also indicates as to how human minds in ancient cultures, in different cultures, thought in similar ways but with different perceptions, was that the five elements, Panchabhutas. The earliest one was in India, the second in China, the third in Greece, and the last, but it derived from the Greeks, was the Islamic culture area. The Chinese five elements, about 6th century, were water, fire, wood, metal, and earth. The vital air was not included in them. They differed from the Indian or Greek doctrine as they were thought of as symbolic representation of natural properties. Thus, water stood for liquidity and fluidity, and so on. The pre-Socratic Greek thinkers around the same time, 6th century BC, like Thales, Anaximenes, Heraclitus, and Empedocles, respectively postulated four of them, namely Thales thought of water, Anaximenes air, Heraclitus fire, and Empedocles earth. But they regarded them as the basic stuff or the roots of the world. They thought of the diversity of the knowable world of matter in terms of their primary attributes of heat and dry, cold and cold, but all in a speculative manner. 100 years later, the Greek intellectual Colossus, Aristotle, you must have heard of his name, added the fifth one called the ether, meaning luminous or shining, but posted it only as a basic constituent of celestial bodies. He thus sought to distinguish the terrestrial from the celestial. This idea held sway over the Western minds for nearly 2000 years, the difference between celestial and celestial, until it was demolished by Newton in the 17th century. The Greek four elements, however, entered the Hippocratic medicine, that is very important, and its idea of four humors, while three in Ayurveda. They were also adopted by Islamic medical men, the Greco-Arabic medicine being known in India as Unani. But the Indian doctrine of five elements had a different pathway, for it was a part of the Upanishadic intellectual tradition that was evolving then around 700 BC. From the cosmogonic concept of one primordial element, namely water in the Rig Veda, it became three elements in the Chandogya Upanishad and five in the Taittiriya Upanishad. Called the Panchabhutas, the five elements were Prithvi, Ap, Tejas, Vayu and Akasha, you might have heard of them. Their English equivalents being respectively earth, water, fire, air and Akasha. But these equivalents are woefully inadequate for connoting the full meaning and significance of the Panchabhutas. Akasha was an element as an element was totally different from the Aristotelian ether. In their origin, the Indian five elements were a part of the Upanishadic ontology and regarded as metaphysical thought structure. But in the new Shaddarshanas, Sankhya, Vaisheshika, and Apurva Mimamsa, they symbolized the physical world of matter, properties, and energy. Thus, they were a springboard of understanding the maximum of sensorial phenomena with the minimum of postulates. For unlike the Greek or Chinese, five elements, Indian five elements were related to five senses. This was the only doctrine which had senses related, because senses are the gateways of human knowledge, opening themselves in the mind, which is the codifier of knowledge. The first four elements also found their way, especially into atomism of the Nyaya Vaisheshika and the Jaina thinkers, as well as the Sautrantikas and the Vaibhashikas of the Hinayana medical sectors Buddhism. In the Ayurvedic core concept of Vata, Pitta, and Kapha of the Tridhatu doshas as biologically vital components, the five elements were intimately involved. The generic idea was that the equilibrium of these three components would be the healthy state, while their imbalance would result in a diseased state. The entire range of metabolic processes, from the intake of food to eventual reproductive essence, the formation of six rasas so necessary for digestion, and the nature of food as well as the curative drug itself have been explained on the basis of the five elements. The diagnostic methods aim at finding out the causes of diseases in the context of the five elements. In the gamut of Ayurvedic curative practices, the five elements have a substantial role. It appears to be, India appears to be the only country in the world today which has the benefit of what may be called medical pluralism. Modern medicine with all of its sophistications, Ayurveda, Unani, Siddha, homeopathy, Yogakur, and folk medicine, besides home remedies. Ayurveda has called a niche for itself and has been recognized by the World Health Organization as an alternative system of medicine. Institutions for Ayurvedic studies and practices have also come up in several other countries, both Western and Eastern, as a tribute to its tradition. This is important. From its beginnings about 2,500 years ago, Ayurveda has traversed a long way and passed through many vicissitudes, but its foundational ideas and practices, fortified by its holistic approach to man in harmony with nature, are its forte. Its unitary conception of mind, body, food, and drug together is its triumph, and its approach to psychosomatic harmony is its inner strength. Ayurveda thus is a respected living tradition integrated with the other intellectual traditions of India. Another living tradition, which is much older, about 3,500 years, is that of Indian astronomy, from Vedic times to the present. I have already indicated its origin. The Vedanga Jyotisha and the pre-Siddhantic texts apart, from over the 5th century AD onwards, right up to the 19th century, many Siddhantic and other kinds of texts came up, luminous and some voluminous. These have meticulously preserved the tradition of mathematical or computational astronomy for about 1,500 years. Three notable characteristics of many of these texts are: one, usage of practically the same technical terminology in Sanskrit. Two, even the chapter headings and the order of the first 5 or 6 chapters are practically the same with some exceptions, although their authors lived in far-off places and different periods. And three, refining the computational methods as and when required, aiming always at accuracy between observation and calculation. It's amazing how a highly standardized scholastic tradition of this kind was assiduously encouraged and preserved over the centuries. Such a tradition can also be observed in respect of Ayurveda, which has, like modern specialties, 8 divisions, namely internal medicine, surgery, pediatrics, ENT, and others. The Brihatrayi are the 3 great classics of Ayurveda, namely Charaka Samhita, Sushruta Samhita, and Ashtanga Vagbhata, have each 120 chapters, no less nor more. Though they deal with these specialties under different heads, each has its originality in the explanation of the line of treatment and associated aspects, but using the same terminology over the long centuries. The Ayurvedic Vaidya, besides possessing sound knowledge of medicine and treatment, was enjoined to follow this is very important. The Ayurvedic Vaidya was enjoined to follow the path of dharma in his relationship with his parents and also in pursuit of his profession. Likewise, there were rigorous qualifications for an astronomer. One of them was, as recorded by Varahamihira, that an expert astronomer should be able to forecast by calculation the occurrence of an eclipse, its commencement, magnitude, and ending. Varahamihira categorically states that Rahu is not at all the cause of an eclipse. Moreover, as the Paurisha Siddhanta of Varahamihira's Panchasiddhantika says, an astronomer who has accurate knowledge of the motions of the sun, moon, and planets acquires dharma, artha, and yashas. A bad astronomer will ordinarily have to go to hell. It is significant to note that it was a sustained tradition of astronomy and the expertise of astronomers from the 5th century CE onwards that India had been the only country in the world, ancient and medieval periods, which had a continuous record of eclipses numbering about 2000, both solar and lunar, till about the middle of the 19th century. These recordings, which are available in a number of inscriptions, are in the nature of predicted ones on the basis of accurate calculations, and most of them are in accord with the NASA dates. A copperplate grant belonging to the Kalachuri era states that an astronomer by name Padmanabha predicted the occurrence of a total lunar eclipse on the Purnima of Kartika 880 of the Kalachuri era, which corresponds to 8th November 1128 AD. And when actually the eclipse occurred on that very night, the king was pleased and gifted some village to him. The lifeline of an inscription is its date line. And Indian astronomers are adapting in preparing, then as now, the annual Panchanga. The large number of inscriptions, perhaps numbering over 1.5 lakhs, owe their historical validity also to the Panchanga tradition, which is the practical phase of Indian astronomy. All varieties of festivals, marriages, and other performances are determined by Panchanga, which in its own manner has been cementing the fundamental unity of India. The reckoning of huge numbers on an ascending decimal scale is called Dashagunottara, with the number names in words, was an accomplished tradition even in the Vedic period. But in the context of the merit of sacrifice or yajna and sacrificial fee in kind like cows, the Jainas went further and recorded numbers up to 29 places and beyond. The Buddhists adopted a centesimal scale and number names up to 10 to the power of 53. The other civilizations like Chinese, Greek, and Greco-Roman did not go beyond 10 to the power of 4. Using a plethora of symbols to denote the desired numbers, this was called the cipher system. Around the 1st or 2nd century AD, it was the Indian innovation that ushered in the now familiar decimal place value system, using only 9 digits and 0, which has since become universal along with the Indian numerals. Indian astronomers were also able mathematicians, and their acumen lay, among others, the use of the versatile system in their texts, which are generally composed in metrical verses in Sanskrit, and thus were not permissive of the use of numerical forms. Verses you can't use numerals. The difficulty was overcome by the use of what are called the Bhuta Sankhya's symbolic words and the alphabets known as the Katapayadi system. The galaxy of Indian mathematicians from Aryabhata the first in the 5th century to those of the Kerala school between the 14th and 19th centuries had blazed new trails in mathematics, some of which were far ahead of similar developments in the West. I am not going to details of it. But their innovations augmented the rich intellectual tradition of India. Finally, Indian intellectual tradition as a whole or in its constituents was not in the nature of an academic exercise, nor a rhetoric. It never followed the dictum, knowledge is power, nor accepted the duality of mind and matter. These two, the first one pronounced by Francis Bacon and the second by his junior contemporary René Descartes, have, along with its characteristic methodology of induction, deduction, mathematical modeling, testing, hypothesis, and so on, this characteristic methodology of science, and sophisticated instrumentation, propelled modern science and technology to become the most powerful enterprise of mankind today. But in this enterprise, the very foundation of Homo sapiens, the word Homo sapiens means man the thinker. Homo is the genus, sapiens is the species. Homo sapiens means humanism. The very foundation of Homo sapiens is humanism. This has become distressingly shaky. About 6 months after dropping the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, I was a second-year chemistry honors student at that time, 1945, and we had a course on radioactivity and also transuranic elements. Plutonium, which was used in atom bomb, had just been discovered 3 or 4 years earlier. And our teacher used to tell us how the energy could be released by bombardment of the nucleus. So it was still in our mind. And when we read these things in newspapers, that 2 bombs were dropped. Today is August 27th. 3 weeks back, August 6th. But 70 years ago, 1945, August 6, one atom bomb, that was uranium-based atom bomb, was dropped on Hiroshima. On the third day, the second bomb based upon plutonium was dropped on Nagasaki. Those 3 days saw the merciless killing of man by man, devastating the lives of 1,45,000 people those 3 days. And another 3 or 4 years, the radiation salts took the toll much more. So we were very much attracted by this at that time, but now on reflection we know what a dehumanizing act it has been. And in fact, Albert Einstein, a few years after dropping the atom bomb, wrote, and I quote, "The horrifying deterioration in the ethical conduct of people today stems from the mechanization and dehumanization of our lives." And he adds, a disastrous byproduct of the development of the scientific and technical mentality. Elsewhere he writes, "I have been in this field of scientific investigation for decades. I have not learned even a single lesson of how to lead a life. I don't know what ethics is." Somewhere else he writes, "A life lived not only for himself, but for the sake of others is the real life, not for himself." So he linked up exclusively modern scientific and technological training to the process of dehumanization. If I remember correct, John F. Kennedy, the president of USA, when during his time, there was a sort of a movement in America that excessive dosage of science and technology, excessive exposure to science and technology without input from a humanitarian division. This leads to mental degeneracy. That's what was mentioned at that time. And Kennedy set up a committee which recommended that all technical courses, purely scientific courses, must have some elective subjects as humanities. Thus, Einstein was emphasizing that despite its enormous beneficial capabilities for enriching our lives, that we can't doubt, science and technology have been dehumanizing man by eroding the basic human values of truthfulness, love, compassion, non-violence, and non-possession. In contrast, over the centuries and even now, Indian intellectual tradition, including our scientific heritage, has been a dynamic and vibrant promoter of humanism and human values through dharma. It would be naive to think that this life-sustaining tradition belongs to the past, for it continues to be relevant to us even now. Traditional astronomy coexists with modern astronomy, and not a day passes without a reference to the Panchanga in Orthodox homes or temples. Traditional Ayurveda coexists with modern medicine, and even preferred in the in certain elements. In several other ways also, India's past heritage resides in its present. The humanizing dimensions of the intellectual tradition of ancient India have a distinct place in modern India too, for a meaningful life based on dharma amidst the material existence enriched by modern science and technology. Thank you very much.